It's time to crack open the box marked campaigns. I've spent a fair amount of time describing how modular adventures are structured, and even how to string scenes together to make a complex and satisfying narrative. Now we're going to start taking on the big one, building a campaign from the ground up. Now in some ways this is much harder than anything we've done before, but in other ways it's easier. I mean, actually in no way is it easier, it's just harder all the time, much, much harder. But, and this matters, we've already covered so many of the bits that make the problem difficult, like telling a compelling story and making the characters have agency. All we really need to do is to work out how to connect all the ideas we've already discussed into a complete campaign. So the first thing to do is to define a campaign. Back in the day, RPG adventures were naturally assumed to be played either as a standalone story or included into a complex campaign model, where the GM would use the pre-generated story as a chapter, or even a diversion from the ongoing development of the PCs. If you perceived that as the way adventures were made, then a campaign was simply two or more of these strung together, so you could have a multi-chapter adventure. In Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, such a thing might be the AGDQ, for example, that series. And that was then. Nowadays, campaigns tend to be done differently. And there are two broad categories that people often describe as campaigns. Now, the first is the sandbox. Essentially, this is an area or region described in arbitrary detail in which the party can frolic and die. Here are worlds, cities, stories, characters, maybe an entire history. Sometimes these are sold as campaigns, and let me be very clear about this, they are not campaigns. They're actually settings in which a campaign could take place. So if those aren't campaigns, what are campaigns? Well, they're the other sort, in fact. In a campaign there may be a huge area described, and it may have a lot of sandbox freedom to enjoy, but the entry point into this area is a story. A story with objectives, characters, obstacles and rewards. I'm currently very familiar with a Traveller campaign called Deep Night Revelation, because it's forming part of the narrative our noble and ignoble travellers are playing right now. But because of that, I can't go into any detail, sorry. So how about another published example? Well, let's go back to that old AGDQ series briefly, because it actually does meet at least the minimum requirements for a campaign. In order to cover this, though, I'm going to have to do a bit of spoiling. I think it's sometimes easier to do this with an actual example, so that's why I'm doing it. But afterwards, I'm going to cover the basic requirements without referring to the spoilers. So if you don't want to know any of the secrets of the AGDQ series, you can skip the next bit, during which I'll display spoilers on screen. We join after that bit, and I'll cover the theoretical bits without the spoilers. Okay? We all clear? I'll give you a second. So, while AGDQ is a campaign, the A part of it is really about character development. It's for getting a character up to speed and ready to face the real story. It does have a narrative connection, but it's not properly bedded into the later story. In the G part of the story, that's the giants part, our heroes learn that a bunch of different types of giant are unexpectedly collaborating in attacks, even though they usually have nothing to do with each other. As they deal with a different group of giants in each module, they begin to learn that these giants have been communicating with each other, but also with a mysterious power living deep underground. If our party wants to stop this sort of thing, they must enter the deep. Now, in the D part, the drow part of the story, our heroes travel through a vast complex of tunnels and dungeons, defeating enemies and learning more about the threat until finally they face the power of the drow, essentially dark elves living in the Underdark. In the finale, however, they learn that even this is not the real threat. Actually, the drow are being manipulated by a powerful demon, one who does not have their best interests at heart, and our heroes are encouraged to take on this foe. That final fight happens in the single Q module, and as I've said before, should ideally be skipped. But that shows how the campaign works. Each adventure is complete in itself, but the characters can advance the underlying story bit by bit in each one. Yes, socks, absolutely. For anyone who has skipped over that spoilery part, we're now going to do this in a generic sense. A campaign is made up of adventures. These have their own beginning and middle and end, but in the case of a campaign, they're all steps on a path to a final conclusion, each giving us some narrative progress. It is a new skill, yes. I'm not that good at it, to be honest, but I am trying to learn. I've literally got 3 screens in front of me and it's very bewildering. There are essentially 2 different ways to structure the elements of a campaign. I'm going to call them serial and parallel structure. And thank you, Ducky, it's appreciated. So in a serial structure, there's an eventual goal. Some final boss to defeat, some final victory to claim, some specific requirement to meet. Essentially, the last module of the campaign simply becomes the finale of the campaign. In this structure, all the other modules simply act as a series of adventures that must be completed, or largely so, in order to reach the final fight. In this structure, an intermediate module might have a specific objective that, when reached, allows access to the next module or mission. As campaigns are often long and involved, these intermediate modules might also be associated with raising the potency of your characters, as they murder hobo their way through each in turn. For that final fight, they might need to be of a certain level, or have certain allies, some key information, a critical item, or simply have studied a specific skill, spell, or other piece of lore. By its very nature, we can see that this sort of structure is required if your characters are expected to level up during the campaign, but is optional if they're going to improve in relatively insignificant ways. Scatter these intermediate requirements and objectives through the intermediate modules as the characters progress from defeating hamsters to squirrels to badgers, and eventually to krakens, or whatever. But there is another option. This is the parallel structure. In this format, the party has a great deal of flexibility as to which adventure they select. They can skip entire modules, be offered different missions, and select the ones they want. Eventually, by some amazing coincidence, they'll find enough information, or enough appropriate skills, and kit perhaps, to be able to take on the final fight. Or they might decide to just go for 1 or 2 more modules first, just to bulk up a bit before the finale. Structurally, by the way, these 2 concepts are very different, but you're probably way ahead of me here. The actual modules are almost entirely identical. All the stuff we've covered about a single strong narrative thread for an adventure applies exactly the same. So why choose one over another? Well, it's because the story demands it. Some adventures might be set in a literal sequence. This sequence could be geographical, for example, because the party has to progress along a narrow path. Don't limit yourself to that as a serial structure, however. It could just as easily be true that the adventures are in a fixed order because of time constraints, where each is set to happen at a particular moment. Other adventures might be more free form. So in these, the party could choose which town to visit first, which quest to approach first. And those stories drive the choice to a parallel structure. So I did say that the modules in each structure were almost entirely identical. Almost. There is an important difference, but it's really easy to incorporate. In a serial structure, the end of a module has to set up the next one. Finish part 1, earn the key, clue, item, or whatever leads you to part 2. In a parallel structure, the reward at the end is part of a puzzle, part of preparedness for the final part of the story, but doesn't point the party to literally the very next module in sequence. In classic campaign structure, the usual intent was to make the adventures work in serial. Not only is it a little easier to do, it's also very good for business. After all, the GM should really own all of the adventures in the series before they can play through the whole narrative. While that's fine, and works, it does tend to feel rather like being railroaded. Because, well, it's literally on rails. No matter how well you disguise the fact, in the individual adventure modules you can't hide the fact that each one leads inexorably on to the next. So one is easy, but feels like railroading. The other is harder, but feels much more liberated. Decisions. It's possible you might remember back in the very early episodes of this BtS show, I discussed the nature of narrative structure in, let's say, theory. I didn't want to get sucked into any actual examples back then because, well, that's what this series is about. We're going to structure our campaign without relying on the serial model or the parallel model entirely. Because we're going to cheat. Always better to cheat if you can. We're going to do a different model, a hybrid model. We're going to allow parallel approaches. But once a path has been chosen, a module undertaken, even if it offered a completely different experience to the other choices the party could have made, we're then going to treat that conclusion as a conclusion on the serial path. In other words, we're going to construct a serial narrative, but each of the steps along that route are going to be parallel enough to allow plenty of freedom. And we're going to do it so well that our players aren't even going to notice. Which will begin next time. But there is one more thing we need to discuss, which is the genre for our series. Now, last time I chose cyberpunk stylings because it was different from the things we were generally doing on the channel. And I'm completely happy to pick another genre for my next example, but I thought this time I'd at least allow the possibility of some sort of interaction with our lovely community. So if you have a specific genre that interests you, whatever it might be, even if there's no rule set commonly associated with it, let me know and I'll build the campaign structure around that. If nobody comes up with an interesting one, I'll pick one of my own, but I warn you, I might go for something really weird, like bedroom farce, or Molière satire, or Jeeves and Wooster. You have been foreshadowed. That's how screenwriters say warned. If anyone has a preference for a particular genre, oeuvre, milieu, or simply mise en scène, let me know in chat or Discord and I'll see what I can do. Until next time.